Vanakkam. Hello friends. We saw in the previous episode of how Tittan Veliyan became ruler of the early Cholas around 25 BCE, succeeding his father Veliyan Tittan to the throne of Urandai. He went on to subjugate many a chieftain such as the chieftains of Por, Kalar and Vahai to name a few, and assumed the title Porvaikko Perunarkilli. In his chronology of the early Tamils, K.N. Sivaraja Pillai traces the Chera ruler contemporaneous with Perunarkilli as Karuvur Eriya Volval Kopperuncheral Irumpore. He is taken as the first ruler of the early Chera dynasty, the Chera ruler who launched the line on a series of conquests. The name Irumpore literally meant big mountain, the opposite of Kurumpore that meant small mountain. Kurumpore Nadan was a term used to denote a chieftain who ruled over a small hilly territory. The significance of this word was extended to the Chera dynasty when and how. Initially, the Chera rulers were limited to the regions of Kuttanadu, literally meaning the country of lakes and swamps, and Kulumur was their capital. Kuttanadu refers to the erstwhile North Travancore region lying on the south of the Periyar river. Periyar in ancient Tamil literature was known as Periyaru and was corrupted into Periyar in the British records. The Periyaru then and now is the lifeline of the Chera country, a perennial river important for agriculture and also important for trade, for it was at the mouth of this river where it entered the oceans that the Cheras built the famed port of Musiri. Kuttanadu was sandwiched to the south and the east by the Ai kingdom, and to the north lay Kudanadu, which was then under the rule of a chieftain known as Yerumai. This is attested to by a line in Ahananuru poem 115, whose author remains unknown, Nun Poon Yerumai Kudanatu Anna. At that time, the capital of Kudanadu was Karuvur. The Chera ruler of Kuttanadu went about extending his territory northward, maybe because of population pressure, surmises KNS, and soon annexed Kudanadu to his kingdom. With this move, he captured Karuvur, the capital of Kudanadu, which then became the capital of the Chera kingdom, and hence his title Karuvur Eriya. As long as they were confined to the territory of Kuttanadu, the Chera ruler could not have assumed the title of Irumpore. But once they annexed Kudanadu, then they had access to the region of the Western Ghats, and the ruler hence took on the title Irumpore, Big Mountain, a name that was used to denote the land, became a title of the ruler. The very term Cheral, meaning a continuous mountain range, Todarchimalai, was itself derived by their establishing their rule in the Western Ghats, opines the noted historian Pandit Savarirayan. He writes in the Tamil Antiquary, a very old archaeological magazine, of how the name Cheral went northwards through the Canaries region to regions that were speaking the Prakrit language, and through that entered the Sanskrit language, where the Cherka linguistic variation rendered Cherala as Kerala. He actually gives this as an argument to support the Tamil root of the word Kerala from Cheral, by which the kings were called. For example, Cheraladan, Cheral plus Adan. So, Karuvur Eriya Volval Kopperuncheral Irumpore, wherein Volval means the shining sword, Karuvur Eriya because of his having captured the territory of Karuvur, and Irumpore because of his entering the regions of the Western Ghats. Remember, we saw in a previous episode of how kings were not known by their proper nouns in these poems. Here also a series of epithets by which we know this ruler, Ko meaning a king and Perum meaning great. All that goes to commemorate the military feats of this Chera ruler in the Sangam works is a single poem sung by the poet Nariveruvu Talayar, and there is only this one poem, which is Purananuru poem 5, sung by this poet with an unusual name, Nariveruvu Talayar, which means one whose head scared the fox, a name that led to silly speculations by commentators who came way later. Cheras mentions his own deduction that this Chera ruler must have been the hero of the first canto of the Padittripattu that is lost to us. The conquest of Kudanadu and the capture of Karuvur were landmark events for the early Cheras, and so it was only logical that the Chera ruler who achieved these victories was seen as the founder of the early Chera dynasty, and he should have had a canto of the Padittripattu dedicated to him. Cheras gives his period of rule as between 25 BCE and the 1st century Common Era. Nevertheless, with no other linked names, Cheras gives his name within brackets in his chronological table, meaning that it required further authentication. However, Cheras also quotes the work of Ptolemy. Now, Ptolemy was a great mathematician, philosopher, and a geographer par excellence who belonged to the Roman Empire and lived in the middle of the 2nd century Common Era. In his Maps of the World, a geographical compendium that was published in 150 Common Era, Ptolemy notes how Karuvur had already been well established as the Chera capital at the turn of the 1st century CE, which means that it should be attributed to Peruncheral Irumburai. Cheras here points out that this Karuvur should not be confused with the later capital of the Cheras, Karur, which was also known as Vanji. In his work, The Tamils 1800 years ago, Kanagasabai Pillai also points out that this Karuvur lay at the foothills of the Western Ghats, about 28 miles east by north of Cochin. Now, there were two parallel lines of Chera kings, two contemporaneous rulers by name Udiyancheral and Anthuvancheral, who succeeded Koperuncheral Irumburai. Cheras surmises that both these rulers should have stemmed from the line of Koperuncheral, and so what was their relationship with the king? He surmises that Udiyancheral should have been the son of Koperuncheral and the heir apparent, while Anthuvancheral should have either been his younger brother or a cousin brother. Probably the first canto of the Padittripattu that is now lost to us could have thrown light on this issue. Why does he conclude that Udiyancheral should have been the son? He gives two reasons, one being that there are several poems in the Sangam literature that talk about the military prowess of Udiyancheral, and the Chera genealogy that is given in the Padittripattu assigns 5 lines of Chera rulers to Udiyancheral and only 3 lines to Anthuvancheral. Secondly, the Padittripattu supplies a strong link by showing that Udiyancheral was married to a Chola princess Nallini, who was the daughter of Thittan Veliyan, who assumed the title Porvaiko Perunar Killi. It is assumed that the Chola king should have given his daughter's hand in marriage only to the crown prince to the throne of the Chera dynasty. This Porvaiko Perunar Killi also had a son, the third in the lineage of the early Cholas, who was known as Mudithalaiko Perunar Killi. He was a contemporary ruler of both Udiyancheral and Anthuvancheral, and there is a Sangam poet by name Yenicheri Mudamosiyar who serves as a lateral link, being a court poet of the Chola king Mudithalaiko Perunar Killi. His poem Purananuru poem 13 is recorded at the court of Anthuvancheral in a very unusual situation. The scenario is that Mudithalaiko Perunar Killi decides to visit Anthuvancheral at Karuvur. Now his court poet Yenicheri Mudamosiyar seems to have preceded his sovereign, maybe to convey the news of his impending arrival to the Chera king. So the setting of this poem is such that Anthuvancheral together with Mudamosiyar are standing atop the king's palace, and they see the Chola king approaching on his elephant, and the opening lines of the poem goes, "If you ask me who he is, then I will tell you. Ivan yar enguvayayin ivane pulinira kavasam poombori sidaya ஏய்கனை கிழித்த பகட்டெழில் மார்பின் மரளியன்ன கழிற்று மிசையோனே களிரே முன்னீர் வழங்கு நாவாய் போலவும் பல் மீன் நாப்பன் திங்கள் போலவும் சுரவினத்து அன்ன வாழோர் மொய்ப்ப மறியோர் அறியாது மைந்து பட்டன்றே நோய் இலன் ஆகி பேர்கதில் அம்ம. You ask me who he is, and I will tell you, starts the poet. First, he describes the valor of his patron, adorned with the royal armor that is full of indentations made by the enemy's arrows that struck him. My king rides a huge royal elephant that resembles a huge warship, and the elephant, surrounded by a retinue of soldiers, slowly moving down the pathway towards the palace, looks like a large ship being surrounded by schools of sharkfish. What the soldiers do not know is that the elephant is in must. Let no harm come to my king who comes from the land of plenty. So initially, both Udhiyancheral and Andhuvancheral seem to have ruled from the regions of Karuvur. But eventually, Udhiyancheral emerges as the successor to the seat of Karuvur, and KNS shows 3 poems in the Sangam works that talk about the military prowess of Udhiyancheral as well as his great philanthropy as a Peruvallal. Poet Mamulanar, whose many songs of the Palaithine we have seen in previous episodes, here presents another beautiful Palai situation in the Agananuru poem 65, where he gives a small pregnant epithet, நாடு கண் அகற்றிய உதியஞ்சேரல் பாடிச் சென்ற பரிசிலர் போல. Like the great king Udiyan, who goes on expanding his territories and gifting generously the bards who sing his praises. Then comes another poignant aham setting in Nattinai poem 113, sung by Ilankiiranar, that goes, Udiyan mandiya olithalai ஞாட்பின் immen பெருங்கழத்து இயவர் ஊதும் ஆம்பலம் குழலின் ஏங்கி கலங்கு அஞர் உருவோள் புலம்புகொள் நோக்கே. The hero says, "Oh," she cried when I left her, and I keep thinking of her tear-filled eyes. Her wailing resembled the sound that emanated from the ambal lute played in the battlefields celebrating the victory of Udhiyancheral. The third poem is a very famous poem that we have seen again in a previous episode, Purananuru poem 2, titled Porum Sorum, sung by Muranjiyur Mudinagarayar, singing the praise of Perunjotru Udiyan Cheraladan. The poem goes, Mantininda nilanum nilanendiya visumbum விசும்பு தைவரு வழியும் வழித்தலையிய தீயும் தீமுரணிய நீரும் என்றாங்கு ஐம்பெரும் பூதத்து இயற்கை போல போற்றார் பொறுத்தலும் சூழ்ச்சியது அகலமும் வலியும் தெரலும் அழியும் உடையோய் நின் கடல் பிறந்த ஞாயிறு பெயர்த்தும் நின் வெண்தலை புணரி குடகடல் குழிக்கும் யானர் வைப்பின் நல்நாட்டு பொருண வான வரம்பனை நீயோ பெரும. The poet eulogizes King Udhiyancheral by comparing him to the 5 elements, the qualities of the Panjabhudam. He is as patient as the earth in forgiving his enemies. He is as strong as the winds when it comes to destroying them. His obsessive thought process to destroy the enemy is as expansive as the sky, and in destroying them, he is like the scorching fire, and in generosity, he is as cool as waters of the rain. His territory is so vast that the sun rises and sets in the regions of the sea that belong to him. Vanavaramban was a title that was taken on by Chera rulers that meant one whose fame reached to the limits of the skies. Then come the most important lines that capture the philanthropic nature of the ruler by the term Perum Soru. Perum Soru was a term that used to denote the act of a king feeding armies, points out the Tamil scholar Kuve Balasubramaniam in his lessons on Purananuru for the Tamil Virtual University. Alangu ulai puravi ஐவரோடு சினையி நிலம் தலை கொண்ட பொலம்பூன் தும்பை ஈரைம்பதின்மரும் பொருது களத்து ஒழிய பெரும் சோற்று மிகுபதம் வரையாது கொடுத்தோய். Here, Udhiyancheral is celebrated as having fed the armies of the Great Five and the Great 100 who fought and died in battle. The late commentators interpreted the Great Five as the Pandavas and the Great 100 as the Kauravas, and concluded that Mudinagarayar was singing about the battle of Kurukshetra from the Mahabharata. KNS points out to the incongruity of it and exclaims that at the best this could be an exaggeration. Yet there is still a better explanation. An explanation given by the erudite Tamil scholar Sengai Poduvan in his blog YN Blogspot, where he shares enormous amount of information on Tamil literary works that is of great benefit to researchers like us. Ivar, meaning Panjavar, was a term also used to denote the Pandyas, either the Pandyas themselves or the Pandyas and a coalition of chieftains that were subjugated by them. Similarly, the term Eeraimpadinmar, which means 100, that is Nutruvar, is associated with a ruler from Andhra known as Sadakarni. Sadakarni was the third ruler of the Satavahana dynasty that ruled in the Deccan regions of Andhra between 80 BCE and 40 BCE. He is mentioned in the Silapadiharam as Nutruvar Kannar. Again, Satakarani was a title, and Kanahasabai Pillai in his Tamils 1800 years ago interpreted Nutruvar Kannar as Sadakarani, Sada meaning 100, which shares a common cognate with the PIE root santam. Sadakarani means one with 100 years, a metaphoric way of saying that the king had 100 spies and had so much of sources of information coming to him. So the battle that Mudinagarayar mentions in this poem should have been between the Panjavar, that is the Pandyas and their coalition, and Satakarani, the Andhra king, both of whom died at the end of the battle. That Satakarni died in battle is a historical fact, and Udi and Cheral fed both the armies in an impartial way. Thus, having consolidated their position in the Periyar basin, the Cheras next started looking towards the east of the Western Ghats, wherein lay the Kongu country. The great chieftain of Yedil Kundram, Nannan, controlled several chieftains of the northern parts of the Kongu country, the regions that lay to the north of the Coimbatore district above the Palghat Pass. The southern part of the Coimbatore district was known as Pullunadu, a stretch of dense forest. It was occupied by several tribes such as the Ayar, the Einar and the Kurumbar. We will continue with our exploration of how the Cheras expanded their kingdom into these territories in the next episode. Vanakkam.